Welcome to Hegel Courses.
This is paragraph 553 from Hegel's Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. And it's the opening paragraph of Hegel's philosophy of spirit. And already we have a very difficult paragraph in front of us. Let's first take a look at the German text. Der Begriff des Geistes hat seine Realität im Geiste. So the concept of spirit, we will see that Bailey and others translate Geist as mind, which has its problems, but spirit also has problems. The concept of the spirit, so the idea of what spirit is. Let's take a look at that first, because spirit is, Geist is Hegel's way of talking about the absolute. So he finds it very problematic that Spinoza talks about spirit or Geist only in the sense of the absolute in itself existing substance. And that's the opening definitions of Spinoza's Ethica, which means that the absolute is posited as something that exists beyond and outside of the human mind. So Hegel's project is to show that the absolute actually is spirit, mind. This concept of the spirit also has a reality. What's the reality of the spirit? Well, it exists as subjective and objective spirit. So as the human mind, the subjective spirit, and as society, objective spirit, which are the two topics of the two previous chapters. So the reality of this concept of mind is something that is only within mind. And so what we need to understand here is that the understanding of the spirit actually is the spirit. It's the spirit in the way that it expresses itself as understanding itself. This element of knowing itself is very important, just like another concept in this context, which is the concept of freedom. So, for instance, we find in Hegel's work this definition: der Geist ist das bei sich selbst sein. So spirit is being with itself, and that is another way of expressing the concept of freedom. This being with itself of the mind or the spirit is self-consciousness, consciousness of itself. So that is something that we will find in the phenomenology and also in the philosophy of the spirit here, that the concept of the mind is real in the understanding of reality as mindful or spiritual. That's where this concept has its reality, not outside of the idea of concept, not just as something that you can look at from the outside, but when we truly understand the concept of spirit, we understand the reality of spirit. The final chapter in Objective Spirit, therefore, talked about world history, because the history of the world is the exposition of the spirit. So, in two meanings, in two senses, that the history of the world is actually the description of the labor of the spirit to come to understand itself, but it's also a development that goes through conflicts and wars and all kinds of events in which the Spirit is, as he says, explained in time. That's what world history is, the explanation, the exposition of Spirit through time. So in terms of the reality of world history and in terms of the self-understanding of the Spirit throughout world history. Difficult concepts to explain. We will talk about that in other videos, of course, when we proceed through the whole chapter of the philosophy of mind. But this is to be understood here at the start. The concept of the Spirit has its reality within the Spirit and not in psychology or in some kind of natural science. The reality of the Spirit is spiritual, something that is only given when the Spirit understands itself and is conscious of itself. Especially when we talk about subjective spirit, therefore, human reality, human intellect, and especially when we talk about society, which is actually the way that spirit gives itself a reality. But how about the absolute spirit then? Let's take a look at the second very complicated sentence. Dass diese, that is the reality, dass diese in der Identität mit jenem, so that the reality which is identical to the concept, which Hegel calls idea, so when the concept and the reality are totally one, dass diese in der Identität mit jenem, als das Wissen der absoluten Idee sei. So when you have a knowledge of the absolute idea, then you have the identity of the concept of the Spirit and its reality. Knowing philosophy as a knowledge of the absolute idea or the absolute Spirit is the way that reality of the Spirit and concept of the Spirit come together and are one. There is an identity between the two. So that has a necessary element, a necessary aspect. Hierin ist die notwendige Seite, dass die an sich freie Intelligenz in ihrer Wirklichkeit zu ihrem Begriffe befreit sei. So, knowledge of the absolute idea implies that this free intelligence, the free intellect of humanity, has to become a conceptual reality. It must be the gestalt, the external form of the idea. We have to find a kind of knowledge, a kind of understanding that is totally in harmony with its object, which is itself. So a true self-knowledge is required here. Now, subjective knowledge externalizes the Spirit and talks about the various elements that make up the human mind. The objective spirit looks at the way the Spirit expresses itself in institutions, in society. And these two are just der Weg, so a path where we ultimately discover this self-knowledge of the Absolute, or the knowledge of the Absolute in the form of a self-understanding, which then also is the reality of the Spirit. Wow, this is not easy stuff. The existence of the Absolute is within its self-understanding. The understanding of the Absolute is a self-understanding of the Absolute. So what kind of a knowledge is necessary that can do this, can express the Absolute, and can express that it itself, as a knowledge, is identical to that objective reality. So we're looking for a very particular kind of knowledge, a knowledge that is commensurate with, is in identity with its object, and ultimately is itself its object. The three forms that Hegel will discuss in this chapter are art, religion, and philosophy, or philosophical sciences. In art in particular, the Absolute Spirit gives itself an external shape. And in art, different from the objective spirit, in art, the absoluteness of spirit is to some degree depicted. It's freedom, the freedom of expression, but also the absoluteness of this expression. We will find out later what that exactly means. So how can we simplify this a little bit? And you must be a bit wary of simplifying Hegel, because you will lose touch with the real nuanced and very precise way of his thinking if you simplify it. But let's say, let's simplify it like this. The absolute is the object of philosophy. Knowledge of the absolute cannot be something external to the absolute, otherwise the absolute would be something relative. It would have something besides it. There can only be one. Only be one absolute. So the knowledge of the absolute should be identical to the absolute. And it should also know itself to be identical to its absolute. But it can only be identical to its absolute when it's not just some kind of subjective knowledge, but something that has expressed itself as a reality. Because the absolute is the absolute reality. Knowledge of the absolute reality gives itself a reality in which it knows itself. And the full and free form of that, of course, is philosophy, where everything is explicit, but art and religion are various forms of that kind of a self-knowledge, still not fully developed and expressed, but it's already there. Let's take a look for a moment at the translation. So the notion of mind has its reality in the mind. I would prefer the idea of Geist simply being reiterated and used here, so the notion of Geist or the notion of spirit. If this reality in identity with that notion, so the reality in the mind, in identity with the notion of mind, the concept of mind, if it is true that this identity of concept and reality of the mind is to exist as the consciousness of the absolute idea, so the awareness and the knowledge of the absolute idea, by the way, already meaning identity of concept and reality, that's what the word idea means in Hegel, then there is a necessary aspect to it, something that is required, and that is that the implicitly free intelligence, our free understanding, must be in reality, in its effective reality, be liberated to its notion. Then you have a reality that is a vehicle that actually carries forward and shows the identity between the intellect or the notion and its reality. So what we had before, the subjective and objective spirit, see, this is why I think this translation is not perfect, because here it's mind and here suddenly it's spirit. And that's not consistent. So the notion of spirit has its reality in the spirit, and then we can talk also about the subjective and the objective spirit. They are to be looked on as the road, as the path on which this aspect of reality or existence rises to maturity. It develops through the self-understanding of the human intellect and the understanding of the society as the expression of human intellect, and it now turns to an understanding and knowledge of the absolute that is contained in it, which is the spirit as the free intelligence that moves history, that expresses itself in art and religion, and is understood and understands itself in the form of philosophy. All of these are very difficult concepts to grasp, but I hope I have given you in this video a first glimpse of what it is all about. And of course we will have to come back to basic notions here in the remainder of our course, our lectures on the Absolute Spirit. So that's it for now. Thanks for listening and thinking with me about these topics, and I hope to see you next time.